we're going to be looking at verse 6 as we continue our series on the Beatitudes. While you're looking there, I want to tell you a story. I got this story off the internet a while back. There was this turtle family, and they decided that they wanted to go on a picnic. And so anyway, they got all their stuff together, and they left out for this picnic to find the perfect spot. And man, they were out there for over a year when finally they found it. This was it, the perfect spot. And so they start clearing away brush and all kinds of other stuff, and that takes like another year. And then they start laying out, the blanket and all the stuff that they had for the picnic, when all of a sudden they began to realize, we forgot the salt. And you can't have a picnic without salt. And so they nominated the youngest turtle to go back to the house and get it because he was the fastest. And, the youngest turtle, he didn't want to do it. He pitched a fit. He cried and finally said, okay, I'll go get the salt under one condition. They said, what's that? He said, you guys can't eat until I get back. He said, promise me, you guys aren't going to eat until I get back. And they said, okay, we promise. We're not going to eat until you get back. So anyway, the youngest turtle, he takes off. Well, a year goes by and he does return. 2 years go by, he's still not back. 3 years, then turns into 5 years. Finally, the father turtle says, you know what, I've had enough. I'm starving. I'm hungry. I have got to eat something. And so anyway, he pulls out a sandwich, and as he's starting to unwrap it and take a bite, the youngest turtle jumps out from behind a tree and says, ha! I knew you guys wouldn't wait on me. He said, no, I'm not going to get the salt. Let me ask you a question this morning. How many of you have ever been hungry? Okay, I know. We love to use that phrase. I am so hungry. But you know what? If the truth be told, I doubt there's anybody in here that's ever really been hungry. Because I'm not talking about a week-long diet or missing a couple of meals here and there. What I'm talking is being to the point of literally starving to death. Ernest Shelton writes about an adventure that he took with 3 friends back in the spring of 1908. They set out, and he wrote about this adventure that they took. They set out from Antarctica in search for the South Pole. And so they got together a lot of provisions and some ponies, and they loaded out, and they set out on this journey. And after several weeks, all their ponies had died, and their provisions had basically run out. And so they had to try and turn around and make it back to the camp without literally starving to death. And he writes about that and what it was like. He says, this is what we thought about the whole way back to camp: food. You see, every moment of that horrible journey back, their minds and their conversation was only on food. Now let me tell you something. That's hungry. Well, you look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, our next beatitude, and Jesus talks about being hungry. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what? For righteousness, for they shall be filled. In other words, Jesus says, if we want to be filled, if we no longer want to be hungry or thirsty, then we've got to do something. And that something is this: we've got to change our diet. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk more about that towards the end of the lesson, but here's the first point that I want to make this morning. We choose what we hunger for. And Jesus here is saying, choose righteousness. Later on, he's going to say, choose God, choose His kingdom, because we have the power to choose what we hunger for. In Daniel chapter 4, for example, you remember Nebuchadnezzar chose to hunger for praise, right? I believe it was in Luke chapter 12. You had the story of the rich fool who chose to be hungry for more possessions. He said, I'm going to tear down these old barns and I'm going to build newer ones. But then also in Revelation chapter 12, Lucifer or Satan hungers for power so much so that he started a rebellion in heaven. And so we choose what we hunger for. And for the disciple of Christ, for the child of God, here's what our appetite is to be about. Jesus tells us, righteousness. He says, hunger and thirst for righteousness. In fact, he says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, he says, seek first the kingdom of God and His what? And His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Now, what's Jesus talking about there? All these things shall be added unto you. Well, if you go back and you look at the context, He's talking about the basic necessities: food, clothing, shelter. He says, don't hunger for those things. He says, hunger for my kingdom. Hunger for righteousness. He says, hunger for me. And He says, all those other things, food, clothing, shelter. He says, I'm going to take care of those things. He says, so don't even bother putting those things on the menu. But that's hard, isn't it? Man, it's hard not to hunger for the things of the world because we are constantly being bombarded with advertisements through the television and through the radio and even just the people that we're surrounded by, on a day-to-day basis, telling us that listen, you need that house and you need a certain type of car and you need, a certain type of clothing. You've got to have everything. You've got to have all this if you are really going to be happy. And so oftentimes we buy into that. And we lose our hunger for what really matters, which is in the Christian life, in the kingdom life, really it's a one-course meal, and that's God. Our appetite should be for God. We don't have to hunger for all those worldly things. We should have a hunger for God. And God says, I'm going to provide. I'm going to give you all those other things. I'm going to take care of you. But I guess really what it boils down to is trust. We want those things. We understand that we need those basic necessities, but do we really trust that if we live for God, if we hunger for Him and search Him out, that God's going to take care of us. He's going to provide for us. It's hard to do, so hard at times that many times, we just kind of make God like this side item. It's just really this appetizer or just this little side item. It's not a whole lot, just a little bit. Give me all this, give me the world, and I'll take a little bit of God to the side, please. What's interesting is, in a sense, the church, or at least in the church, we've almost had to beg people to be righteous. We've pounded our pulpits and we've pleaded and we've begged with people, live for God. Do what God wants you to do. Hunger for Him. Hunger for His kingdom. But you know what? Think about this. You don't have to beg a hungry man to eat. And in a spiritual sense, if an individual is truly hungry for righteousness, if he's truly hungry for God, you know what? You don't have to beg them to come eat either. You don't have to guilt them. You don't have to shame them. You don't have to scold them. You don't have to lecture them. Are we hungry for God? For His righteousness? In Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2, these two passages that I'm going to read, they just, over the last several years, has just been convicting to me. Because here's what the psalmist writes: as the deer pants for the water brooks, the psalmist says, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Now, notice how the psalmist starts out. He starts out with a picture or an image of a deer, and he's thirsty. Maybe this deer's been running from a hunter, or maybe he's been running from some other prey, and his mouth is just dry. He's been running, and now he's thirsty. How many of you have ever been thirsty before? You just felt like, man, I've got to have something to drink, or I'm just going to die. My kids at times. We'll be driving down the road, and they're like, Dad, I'm thirsty. And I tell them, well, I'm driving right now. We're not at home, and they're like, "But Dad, I'm thirsty. I've got to have something to drink right now. You can't wait till we get where we're going. No, I've got to have something right now." And some of you understand that. You've got this thirst, and that's the picture we have. This image of this deer. He's thirsty. And the question is, do we thirst for God like that? Do we long to have God like that? At times you talk about worship, and especially with our young people many times, you talk to them about worship, and it's just like, do I have to go today? Or as adults, not only is it attendance, but studying our Bibles, praying. I've been so guilty of this at times. Man, I've got to study my Bible today. Man, I've got to pray. And we'll even use little phrases. Well, I'll say a quick prayer. Are we really hungry for God? Like the psalmist is talking about here, man, just like a deer that's just thirsty for water. God, I'm thirsty for you. I've got to have you. I've got to come before you, be in your presence. In Psalm 63, verses 1 through 5, he goes on to say, "O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water." Just imagine the imagery here. Here you are. You're out in the desert. There's no water. You're looking for something to drink. It's hot. Your mouth is it's dry. He says, God, that's how I feel about you. I'm thirsty for you. I'm longing for you. He says, "So I've looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and glory, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise you. Thus I will bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul will be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips." I just can't wait to come before you, God. I just can't wait to be with you. I long for that. Does that describe us? I think really the question is this: how much do you want God? Do you want just a side order, just a little bit of God, or do you want Him as the main dish? There's a story about Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower and how they actually came together. It's really fascinating. Dwight saw Mamie at a dinner. And so he went up to her and he asked her out on a date, and Mamie said, "Well, call me in a month." Well, he found out her number and he called her the next day. In fact, he called her every 15 minutes until she agreed to go out with him. Then, the day they were supposed to go out, he showed up 4 hours early for the date because he could not wait. And then guess what? 3 months later, they were engaged to be married. And I just think about that from a spiritual standpoint. Do we have the desire that Dwight had for Mamie? That, I want you. God, I want to serve for you. I want to serve you. I want to live for you. God, I can't do anything without you. Well, Slate, I don't know why, but I've lost my appetite. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and that doesn't describe me. And the question is, why do we lose our appetite for God? And I think one of the reasons, and I think this is especially true today, is because we've become too busy to be hungry. You ever been too busy and just didn't notice that you forgot to eat? Maybe you're at home working around the house, or maybe you were at the office and you just got so busy that you forgot to eat all day long. I think probably all of us have been there at some point, and I think that can happen in our spiritual lives as well. We can get so busy that we forget to be hungry for God. And here's the thing. The first sign of spiritual illness is a loss of appetite. And what's even more scary is there are times in our lives when we have just become so busy consuming so many other things in this world that we don't even realize we've lost our appetite. And that's so scary to me. You see, the God that used to be our passion can become our obligation. May describe why you're here this morning, not because you desire God, but maybe it's what your parents want you to do. Or maybe it's what you've always done. Kind of reminds me of Jacob in the Old Testament. Remember Jacob and how Jacob, he's running from his brother and he goes to his uncle Laban's house. And his uncle Laban has two girls, one named Rachel and the other named Leah. And man, he just falls head over heels for Rachel. And so he goes to his uncle and he says, Uncle Laban, what will it take for you to give me your daughter Rachel in marriage? He said, work for me for 7 years. 7 years, and she is yours. And so he works those 7 years, and the Bible says he loved her so much that the 7 years, they just flew by. And at the end of the 7 years, you remember they had the marriage ceremony, and Laban, his uncle, deceived him. He tricked him. And instead of giving him Rachel, he gave him the other sister, which was Leah, which he didn't care anything about, but they were married. And Jacob, he didn't divorce her. He kept his commitment. He kept his obligation. He provided for her and so forth. But he didn't really want Leah. He wanted Rachel. And I think many times that's how we make God feel, like Leah instead of Rachel, because many times we go to church and we keep our commitments and we fulfill our obligation and we punch our time cards, but you know what? We'd sure rather have Rachel. But you know what? Here's the deal. God is no Leah, and the things we hunger for more than God is no Rachel. We get so busy, tied up in those things. I don't usually read a poem, but I found this on the internet, and I just thought it fit in well, and I'm going to read it to you. I knelt to pray, but not for long. I had too much to do. I had to hurry and get to work, for bills would soon be due. So I knelt and said a hurried prayer and jumped up off my knees. My Christian duty was now done. My soul could rest at ease. All day long I had no time to spread a word of cheer, no time to speak of Christ to friends. They'd laugh at me, I fear. No time, too much to do. That was my constant cry. No time to give to souls in need, but at last the time to die. I went before the Lord. I came, I stood with downcast eyes. For in His hands God held a book. It was the book of life. God looked into His book and said, "Your name I cannot find. You know, I once was going to write it down, but I never found the time." What if God many times treated us the way we treat Him? What if God never made time for us the way we oftentimes don't make time for Him. You say, well, Slate, how can I get my appetite back? I mean, I hear what you're saying, and yes, I'm guilty. I've lost my appetite. I've become too busy. But how do I get it back? Well, first of all, we have to refuse to fill our souls with junk food. I told you that we were going to come back and we were going to talk about changing our diet. You know, there was a guy who was in good shape, filmmaker, and he did this documentary of himself where he ate 3 meals a day at fast food restaurants for 30 days. And at the end of those 30 days, after eating all that junk food for 30 days, he had packed on 25 pounds. When they interviewed him, how his body was doing, he said, my body is basically just falling apart. He said, I've started to get tired. I've started getting headaches. My blood sugar skyrocketed. My cholesterol went up off the charts. And the doctors have told me, you've got to stop. And they said, well, how do you feel now? He says, I feel terrible. But he said, here's the thing. He says, you know, I want to eat because eating for a short period of time, it makes me feel good. I get all that sugar and that caffeine and all that fat. But then an hour later, he says, it's crazy. He said, I just crash. He said, I hit a wall. And he said, I become angry and depressed and upset. And I'm just this disaster to live with. But anyway, what this guy is saying is this physical junk food, you don't want it. It's not good for you. So stay away from it. You don't need to live on that stuff. And in a spiritual sense, that's what Jesus says to us. John chapter 6, verse 27, he says, don't labor for the food which perishes. Don't give everything you've got for the things of this world, the things that are going to be burned up one day and done away with. He says, but for the food which endures everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set His seal on you. Also in John chapter 4, verses 13 through 14, Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. He's talking about physical water, but he says, whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. You see, our souls growl just like our stomachs do. We have those hunger pains. Where we get hungry, but the sad thing is so many times we pull up to the wrong buffet. You know, we go to the local mall and we buy a new toy. Or we go to the drugstore and we try a new pill. Or we go to the local bar and we find a new body, and guess what? Those things, they don't fill us up. That's what Solomon said over and over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes. He said this stuff's like chasing the wind. You think, man, this is going to fill me up. And when it doesn't, you move on to the next thing, and this is going to fill me up. But it doesn't. And we just keep moving on to the next thing. It's like Augustine once said, our hearts are restless until they find thy rest in you, O Lord. And so we gotta do away with the spiritual junk food, but also if we want our appetite back, we gotta refuse the surface righteous menu. You know, there are some people who think they can live off spiritual appetizers such as attendance, going to Bible class, or being a part of programs and activities here at the building. And all those things are wonderful. I'm not downing those things, but let me tell you something. If that's all you're getting in a week's time, it's just the little bit that you get here within this building, let me tell you something, you're going to starve to death. You see, too many people never hunger and thirst for God. They nibble on the surface of righteousness. They come to church, they punch the time cards, and they go through the motions, and once that's done, you know, I'm good to go. But if that's all you're getting, you're going to starve to death spiritually. In fact, Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, if you remember going back, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." And don't you know that those who were listening that day, the Pharisees, were saying to themselves, "That's us, baby." I mean, we are the ones who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's us. But then Jesus goes on to say in verse 20, He says, "Your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees." You say, why? Well, because these guys were doing the bare minimum. You ever try to work that into the equation? You know, what have I got to do? What's the bare minimum that I've got to do to get myself into heaven? What's the least effort that I can put into this to make sure that one day I can be with God? And God just says, "Look, I'm not going to bless that. You need a deeper righteousness. God is only going to bless a hunger that goes deeper beneath the surface, into your motives, into your deepest thoughts." You see, there's something that we all need to understand about Jesus and what He's teaching here, and that's this: there is no such thing as having enough of God. You know, I'll just go on Sunday morning because that'll be enough. Or if I can just squeeze in Wednesday night, that'll be enough, guys. Just the bare minimum. Let me tell you something. We can never get enough of God. And Jesus lived that out. I'm going to have to go ahead and close out. I want to finish with this story. It was written by a man by the name of Franz Kafka. And he wrote a story called The Hunger Artist. And the story went like this. Once upon a time, there was a man known as the Hunger Artist. He made his living by professional fasting. There he would sit on some straw in a small cage, expressing his willpower to go for long periods without eating and drinking. He would fast for 40 days, and when the 40 days were up, the band would play, his manager would give a speech, then two attractive ladies would lead him in his weakened condition out of the cage. The crowd would roar with excitement, and ultimately they would pay him a great sum of money in appreciation for his great work of art. However, there came a time when professional fasting was no longer appreciated by the people. And so the man lost his manager and he had to join the circus. And when he hooked up with the circus, he became down and depressed, despondent and discouraged because of the raw meat that constantly passed him, because of the roaring of the animals at night, because of the horrible smell in the air. But most of all, the people no longer paid attention to him. They rushed to the more popular exhibits in the circus. He was ignored and forgotten about. Even the leaders and the owners of the circus forgot about him. His fast went way past 40 days because nobody bothered to count the days anymore. And ultimately they found him one day half conscious, slumped over in his cage. They rushed over to assist him. In his last dying breath, he told this secret. He simply said, "I have to fast. I have no choice. You see, I couldn't find any food that would satisfy me." Let me repeat that last part. I couldn't find any food that would satisfy me. Now here's the part that I find very interesting. The author of this story, Franz Kafka, was an atheist. You think there's something to that? Jesus says in John chapter 6, verse 48, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." But the question is, are we hungry for God? If not, we need to ask ourselves the question, why? Why not? If I just got so wrapped up in consuming other things, becoming busy with other things that God is no longer first in my life? Or it may be that you're here this morning and you've never given your life to Christ. But you know what? You're tired of going through the same old motions of trying, chasing other things in this world, only to discover that, you know what? It's not going to make you happy. It's not going to fill you up. If you want to be filled, hunger and thirst for God and His righteousness. If you need to respond, won't you come? Together we stand and sing.